Group Captain Cheshire, may I welcome you to the Royal Air Force Staff College and thank you very much indeed for agreeing to participate in our television interview series.
No, thank you. It's a privilege for me.
Thank you, sir. I wonder if we could go back initially to the days in 1936 when you joined the University Air Squadron in Oxford.
Yes.
Now, you weren't in fact all that enthusiastic about flying initially, were you? Wasn't there a slight delay between you actually joining and you turning up at the airfield to get some flying in?
Well, I'd forgotten that, but I remember that we were expected to join one of the cadet corps, or whatever they were called, and I don't know why I naturally thought of the Army. And I applied for the cavalry. But it turned out you had to get up at about 6:45 and report to some indoor hall. And you could never get on a horse in a civilized way. You had to jump on, you had to somersault off backwards. And I thought, this isn't for me. So the better course seemed to be flying.
So you joined the University Air Squadron and in fact very quickly developed a very, very high degree of efficiency and joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in 1937, I think shortly after going solo, didn't you? Still flying at Abingdon.
It's my instructor I remember more than...
Is it?
Yes. I had a wonderful instructor in Charlie Whitworth. He was a great character throughout the war.
Yes. You were going to come across him once or twice, weren't you, in the course of the war?
He really sort of...
Yeah.
He was tough, but I mean, he gave me the push that I think I needed.
Yes, yes. You went from there, or soon after the outbreak of war, you were posted to 9 FDS at Hull Abington. And it seems odd to a certain extent, because although you had demonstrated prowess as a single-seat pilot, and you were going to demonstrate that degree of prowess again later, you seem almost naturally to have been moved towards a bomber training. Was there anything significant in that at all? Any reason that you can recall?
Well, I can recall the situation quite easily. I know that we were given 3 options at Hull Abington as to which command we wanted, operational command we wanted to be posted to. And I know that I put 3 down: Fighter Command, Light Bombers and Army Co-op, and I got neither. I got Bomber Command. And I know that Bomber Command was the one place I did not want to go to. Because you used to read about these dreadful deep penetration raids into Germany, and I thought, I just can't see myself doing that.
Yes.
But I think it was just a fluke of the system.
Yes. Odd.
Yeah, we wondered why on earth ask us if it's not going to take any notice.
Right. You went from Hull Abington to Abingdon to the OTU.
Yes.
And among what was otherwise a more or less routine development, there was an unusual circumstance, was there not? Which very, very nearly put an end to your career before it had started.
Oh, yes. Yes, there was.
Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I was in a pub one night and the conversation was a bit boring, so I think I said in a deliberately loud voice that there were 40,000 Germans marching on Abingdon. And I meant it as a joke, and I couldn't see anybody could take it except as a joke. It evidently got reported to the group commander, who was McNeice Foster, who'd been my father's wartime commander, as it happened. And I was hauled up in front of him, but I'd been warned first, because he'd seen my father, that I was not to excuse myself, I was just to accept whatever he gave me. So I did. I walked in, I apologized, and I was very sorry, and I was let off. But I think it may be that had there not been such an understanding man, I might not have got through that course.
Yes, I believe he reflected at the time that he was considering putting you into the infantry. And the reason that intrigued me, talking a little while ago to Lord Elworthy, he very nearly lost his career too. This was a little bit later. Yes, he was working for the newly appointed Air Chief Marshal Harris, and the Air Marshal, as I say, dispensed with his services for a short while, and one is left with the reflection that a very influential man, again, came very, very close to having no influence at all. But thereafter, you moved north to Driffield, didn't you, to your first squadron as a squadron pilot.
Yes.
And Driffield in June 1940
Yes.
when most of the country was concentrating on the affairs and events of southeast England.
Yes.
What sort of recollections have you of going to that first squadron? The targets, the flying, the kind of way the squadron went about its duties?
My main recollection is I was very frightened when I turned up. Every now and then you suddenly sat down and thought, well, how am I going to behave when I really get in action?
Mm.
And you sort of see yourself, as it were, stark and naked. And you think, will I make it? And I think I expected to find sort of a lot of heroes walking about. I don't know what I expected. But I wasn't expecting to find everybody so normal. They were just going about their job as if they were doing nothing different from anywhere else. And somehow you got carried along in the stream. And you realized that the one thing you couldn't do was be different from them. Even if you were frightened, you couldn't afford to show it because you didn't want to be the one man alone who looked frightened. There are two other recollections I have, and that was the second day I got there. I was put down to fly on and off with a crew, and then taken off at tea time, and that crew never came back. And instead I was given, I should think, as good a first captain as anybody could ever have. He was a man called Long, and he was 6'2", a New Zealander, we call Lofty. And most captains would only put their second dickie in the flying seat after they'd finished the target and crossed the enemy coast on the way back. But Lofty would put me in the seat quite early on. I mean, after we'd done 3 or 4 trips. And he gave me a confidence and a start that I don't think most people had. And I think that for that reason, and for the other reason, that he made me absolutely spend every minute I had learning the machine. He was completely professional, and I think he drilled it into me that you also have got to be totally professional. He made me spend hours in that Whitley, blindfolded me, made me find my way around the aircraft, and I think that was a lesson that you need to learn.
How long did you spend as second pilot? Can you remember?
I think I did about 10 trips or something like that. But I still look back to Lofty as somebody who gave me my break.
That was in the period, late 1940, and it was in November of that year that you had your first very serious incident, a narrow escape, wasn't it?
Yes.
Over Cologne. Could you recall that, anything at all of that incident?
Yes, I remember that quite. I don't remember many things vividly, but I remember that vividly.
Yeah.
We were going into Cologne, or somewhere near Cologne, and I think we were more or less on our own. I can't remember why. And there was a complete, absolute silence. There wasn't a gun, there was nothing. And in a funny way, it gave you a very eerie feeling. It was much worse than seeing the guns firing. You felt there's something wrong, there's a trap, there's something. And it was a moonlight night, and there was no cloud. We could see the ground. And we were just sailing slowly in towards whatever the target was, when somebody shouted out gunfire, but there wasn't much I could do because we were running in and couldn't afford to take evasive action on a bombing run. And 2 shells hit us, in fact, but I was only aware of one that came up through the nose, where the bomb aimer sat, and it must have exploded just somewhere up above me. And it temporarily, I think, knocked me out for a second or two. And when I came to, I realized that we were plummeting. I realized the engines had stopped and that we were finished. And I'd often said to myself, what's it going to be like when you got a parachute? I dreaded the thought of having to jump in a parachute, but I consoled myself by saying, oh, well, when the moment comes, you won't mind. But funnily enough, now the moment had come, the only thing I didn't want to do was jump out. It just seemed, don't jump out. And after a bit, the smoke began to clear, and I suddenly heard something in my ears, and I realized the engines were running. So I looked at the instruments, and I saw the engines were performing normally. I eased the stick back and saw she responded, and I realized that, in fact, we weren't We were under control. Well, the rest is a long story because the other shell had burst in the fuselage and had ignited the photo flash. I mean, one of the flares. The bomb aimer, Wiley Sock managed to get the photo flash out just in time, but his face was completely burnt to pieces. So he saved the aircraft. Somebody said the aircraft's on fire, and the only thing you can answer to that is, well, try and put it out. And they did put it out. And I think we had a big hole in the side of the fuselage, none of which I quite knew at the time. We dropped our bomb. We did our best to drop it on some target, if not the actual target. We just limped home.
And that, in fact, was the occasion of your first DSO, wasn't it? And the bomb aimer also received a decoration.
Yes, he did.
His part in that.
Well, they all deserved it, but
yes.
Of course you don't get the whole crew getting a decoration.
No. Losses must have been very high at that time on the Whitleys. Do you recall? Perhaps not.
Well, I recall that very few of my original course survived. Lofty didn't survive.
Yes.
Hardly any of those. Dingy Young went to 617, but he was killed there. But the Whitley was a very substantial aircraft. You could get hit in a Whitley harder than most aircraft I knew, even though it was slow.
Then, in fact, you'd got very little time left on Whitleys because you went
Yes.
on to the new Halifax, didn't you? At
Yes.
the beginning of 1941 to Linton-on-Ouse, to 35 Squadron.
Yes.
What were your impressions of this new enormous beast? Or did it appear an enormous beast? When you
Yes,
first
it
went
did
to
appear enormous. We were rather frightened of it because there was no duel then. You just did one circuit and bump, standing behind the pilot. And having done that, you were off on your own. And it wasn't a very comfortable feeling. The first time I landed, I got it down all right. We slewed off at about 45 degrees. So you learnt to treat her with caution. But she wasn't really, as we discovered later, a safe aircraft. There was no margin of error when you got near to the stall.
Was this aerodynamic or engine power? Or?
It was aerodynamic. We suddenly became aware that nobody ever came back on 3 engines. And that was suspicious. And I remember I took the aircraft up and deliberately stalled her. And I found that you couldn't get out of the stall. The only way you could get out of the stall was to apply both opposite engines and both feet on one side of the rudder and use all your strength. And only then you just got out. So it was clear that a man who had an engine knocked out on ops would have no chance. The difficulty was you could not persuade Handley Page to do anything about it, because he'd made a pledge of turning out so many aircraft, and he had to weigh that against the actual safety of the aircraft itself, until a test pilot at Boscombe Down was killed doing the same experiment, stalling it. And then they redesigned the rudders, or tail fins, if my terminology is wrong.
That was when the aircraft were recalled.
Yeah.
And refitted.
Yeah.
Yes.
They needed it.
Yeah. Because that, in fact, slowed down the impact of the Halifax considerably, didn't it? Really, when you're talking about a Halifax coming into squadron service at the beginning of 1941, it really didn't make a great deal of impact for quite some time.
No.
After that.
Well, it was a long time before they redesigned it.
Yes, yes.
I was on my second tour of Halifaxes, we discovered
With 76. Goodness. In June 1941, I don't know if you can recall, but I believe that was the time when the camera was introduced by Bomber Command in an attempt to get a more accurate measurement of bombing effectiveness. And I think it's your biographer, or one of your biographers, who comments that you weren't in the slightest bit surprised by the evidence that the camera was producing, because you'd already begun to question the bombing methods that were used at the time.
Well, I don't think really, if we're honest, there was much doubt about the fact that we were not very accurate bombers. I mean, I don't know how you could be with the equipment then. And I know that already in my first Whitley squadron, I'd begun to think that it would be better to make an all-out effort to destroy your target on your one attack than to have to keep going back. And it seemed to me the only way you could do that was to do it low level. we were never allowed to try at low level, and there was no Object 1 aircraft doing it on its own, because that really would prove nothing. But I know that I put a paper up to the CO, and I know that I continued to feel that we were operating under too great a disadvantage, forced higher and higher because of flak, increasing the defences of the aircraft to ward off fighters and protect yourself from flak, bad weather, and the fact that there's an inherent problem in high-level bombing, that in order to bomb accurately, you've got to see your aiming point, but you've got to see it about 20 miles away. And you can't identify it, in fact, till you're overhead. So this is why I personally questioned the basic thinking behind the technique that PFF was using. I think probably a mixture of their technique and our technique on fair weather days would have been better.
Yes, well, we'll come on to that in a couple of minutes, if we may, thinking about the Pathfinder Force. So in January 1942, you moved to the Halifax OCU at Marston Moor and stayed there for some 7 or 8 months before you moved back to take command of 76 Squadron. In this intervening period, you had flown on 2 of the 1,000 bomber raids, which the then newly appointed CNC of Bomber Command had introduced. When you got back to 76 Squadron, were there any obvious changes that had taken place on the front line since you had left 35? Can you recall, was there any impact at that point of the new CNC? Had his presence begun?
Yes, there was a much greater sense of urgency and purpose.
Already?
Yes.
Already at that time?
That's the second time I noticed that. When I first joined my operational squadron, Churchill was not Prime Minister. And our worry was, will they go on fighting? You didn't feel there was a lead from the top. Only when Churchill came did you feel, now we're going to see it through to the end. And without in any way lessening and trying to detract from what other CNCs did, when Bomber Harris came, you knew that Bomber Command was going to see it through to the end. And you sort of felt a push.
How?
I can't tell you. I don't know how it is that what a CNC is at the remote top filters through to the man in the frontline squadron, but it does. And I know that just everything somehow seemed different. And we felt at last that we were really going to have to pull our socks up and get on with it. Before that, we were going off on these attacks. We were not hitting the target. We were doing our best. It was very disheartening to keep coming back and saying, no, I'm not sure that I've hit it. But we weren't sure that we'd hit it. We couldn't see that it was doing much in terms of changing the course of the war. So I think this new leadership gave us a new impetus and a new hope, which as a fighting man you need.
Yes. Yes.
You need to know that what you're doing is useful.
Yes.
Then you don't mind accepting the risk.
Again, so perhaps we can come back to that later on when reflecting on the problems of leadership at various levels. Do you have any other particular recollections in your time of OC 76?
Yes, I remembered the lesson of Lofty. And I thought, if Lofty's done that for me, I must do that for somebody else. So I think that throughout my time there, with the exception possibly of my rear gunner, I flew every trip with a new crew. I'd take a new crew that came on, and I would fly them, they acting as second dicky. Because by that time, crews were being turned out much faster. They were coming into the front line squadrons much quicker. Yes. They were getting less chance of being helped, you know, over that threshold of your first trip. And I found they all responded very well. I don't think that we suffered much inefficiency, as distinct from having your own permanent crew.
You had one or two problems of what the RAF called LMF, low moral fibre, didn't you?
Yes.
And you, I believe, had one or two different ways of dealing with it.
You were caught in a trap with on a pincer with LMF, because on the one hand you couldn't afford to let it go for the sake of others, but equally you felt a great sympathy for the man, because, I mean, you can't really tell what's going on in somebody else's heart. And after all, he was a volunteer. He was doing his best. And somehow you felt you had to protect him from getting too severe treatment. I forget how we used to deal with it, but I know that we used to try very hard to protect him from getting demoted and sent away in disgrace.
Did you not take one of them onto your own crew? Or is mine
Yes, I may have taken the rear gun onto my own crew.
I think you did. I think there was a rear gunner that you
I mean,
took
often
your
if
own
somebody
crew.
gives a help up, they get over that
Quite,
mental block, and then you're all right.
quite. Well, just as the Battle of the Ruhr was beginning to get underway in spring of 1943, you in fact were promoted again, given acting rank, and went to
Yes.
become station commander at Marston Moor at the then
Yes.
unprecedented age of 25 as a station commander. Broadly, so, how many men and aircraft did you have under your command? Can you recall roughly?
1,800, 2,000 men, I suppose.
2,000, yes,
30, 40
aircraft.
aircraft. It was an OTU,
Yes.
heavy conversion
Yes,
unit.
right. How was your time occupied on a daily basis?
Well, you've got to understand I was out of my element.
Why was that?
Well, I hadn't come up in the normal channels of the RAF. I'd only joined with war.
Yes.
I'd nearly been most of my time in operational squadron or station. In Bomber Command, because of the losses, if you were fortunate and got through, then you got rapid promotion. So I found myself promoted very rapidly to a position that I hadn't really been trained or equipped to fulfill. To begin with, I had great trouble with the station warrant officer because he knew King's regulations backwards, and he was perpetually quoting them at me, and I had no idea whether they were right or wrong. I just felt I'm out of my depth, and I think I tried to compensate for it by being as active as possible. And one thing I felt was that they were just a training unit, and they couldn't quite see the relationship of what they were doing to the war effort. So I thought you must try and relate it to them in visual terms. So number one, I tried to explain it to them as best I could, that what happened over Berlin was as much due to the cook who cooked your meal as it was to the person who was dropping the bomb. At least there was a similar relationship. And secondly, by setting a target of aircraft flying hours per month and putting a big thermometer up on the side of the hangar and actually adding 15% on to what we should have done, and saying if you reach that before the end of the month, you're all on leave till the end of the month. So unfortunately that was cancelled by Air Ministry. So, something you shouldn't do. But nevertheless,
You mean your plan was cancelled by a ministry?
yeah, they wouldn't let me send them on the extra leave.
Yes.
But it had a very noticeable effect. That the minute people can see what I'm doing is useful and fits in, they responded. I think I tried to relate as much as I could to all ranks on the station. I think I found that you can relate in a very personal way to a very junior member of the station without him abusing that relationship. Depends how you do it. But basically it was my sort of stormy period. I felt really sort of caged in. I felt this isn't my job. I don't see any way out.
Yes, you had tried to get off, hadn't you? You tried
I was
to get out
trying
of it
every
to
way
start
I could, but
with.
you see, I had to get demoted
Yes.
to get off. That was the problem. And the AOC car had very kindly obtained special permission from Air Ministry to promote me to group captain.
Yeah.
So I now have to ask him to demote me.
But all this time, were people subjecting you to the same pressure? Did you have pilots coming to you saying, I want to get away from OTU and get back onto the squadrons?
A few.
And how did you deal with them?
Well, I mean, I could send them back after they'd done they were only... The thing was, I'd done my third tour,
Yes.
and I officially was not going to fly again. They were still in the middle of it, so therefore they had a right to go back.
Yeah, I see.
It wasn't quite the same thing.
And wasn't it during this period at Marston Moor, you had a slightly different kind of visitor from the Pathfinder Force, and you tried to get a job there?
Yes, the AOC PFF came up, and I thought, well, there's my opportunity to ask him But he said he'd have to test me up before he'd decide whether I thought, well, I'm not going to have that.
What did you say to him when he said he got it? What did you actually say to this? Was he an Air Vice Marshal or still an Air Commodore then?
He was an Air Vice Marshal.
What did you say to him?
Well,
Can you remember?
I don't think we'll repeat that. Well, it did me a good turn because I got something better.
Yes. Well, of course, in October 1943, you in fact relinquished your group captain rank and took command of 617 Squadron, which you tried to get before.
No.
Had you not?
No, I never.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I was under the impression that before you went to Marston, you'd suggested...
No, because I went to Marston. It was at Marston that we heard the news of the dams.
Ah, yes.
And I mean, it was just a spectacular attack. I knew nothing about it.
Yes.
I didn't know they needed a CO or anything.
Oh, I see. I beg your pardon.
No, that was the kindness of somebody, I think of Carr.
Ah. So in October, you went to this squadron who'd already got the dams and Peenemünde, in fact, under their belts by that time, hadn't they?
Yes, I'm sure they've done a lot, yes.
I think they had.
Done the key.
And you had, you were an author at this point as well as, perhaps we could come back to that later on if we may say. How were you regarded when you went to 617?
Well, I was inevitably regarded as an outsider. I don't think they quite understood why they needed somebody from outside their own ranks to be their new CO, and they didn't really, because they had Mickey Martin. Mickey Martin would have done it very well. I had never thought of that side of it before I arrived, but the moment I got on the station, I was aware of it, of course. I think what saved me is that I had to go and report first to Cochrane. And I'd been told that I wouldn't get on with Cochrane, that he was very strict and he had no sense of humour. Well, I found he was strict, but strict in the best possible sense of the word. You saw that he had a superb brain, a very, very sharp mind. And he said to me that I was going to go off and do 3 weeks conversion course onto Lancs. And of course, you know how you are when you're young, you just feel rebellious. And this absolutely shocked me to think that after having flown Halifaxes all that time, I now had to go and do a conversion course onto Lancs. Well, I had to do it, and of course I realized after the second day that I was learning to fly a Lanc in a way I'd never taught myself on my own. I don't really know how I could have been so stupid. But that, I know, gave me an edge that without which I wouldn't have held my own with the squadron.
That would have been a problem, learning to handle the aircraft and
yes,
the
you see, I had to,
A,
prove myself as a leader, or at least get them to accept me,
Yeah.
and B, they were putting me to the test on low-level flying.
Yes.
Because they'd been practicing for months, low-level flying, in formation, at night, below tree level. And if the leader of the formation makes a mistake coming up to trees, number 2 and number 3 have had it. And of course, they'd also learnt to tuck their wings in behind each other. They knew this was a bit frightening when they did it for the first time, so they were out to test me from start to finish. But it wasn't a bad thing. You know, I mean, I wasn't able to take things for granted and think, well, here I am, this is very nice.
Yes, there was a slightly more light-hearted incident, I think, at this time. Was there not an occasion of a parade, your first squadron parade? Was that with 617, where your knowledge wasn't just lacking in King's regulation, but lacking in parade drill as well? And when you got to the end of the parade, what did you say? You didn't say parade dismiss, or ask the warrant officer to move them on, or move them out, or something of that order.
Well, I've forgotten, but I know that I've never, ever in my life felt at home on a parade.
Yes, yes.
I don't know why they're frightening, but they frighten me.
So, you did, in fact, take a firm grip on the squadron, and this, to say it's an exciting time is rather trite, really, to talk about it at any time in a war, but it was a very challenging time for 617, wasn't it? And your name is associated in that period, perhaps above everything else, with the development of the low-level marker technique.
Yes.
Would you care to explain that, please?
Well, the job that 617 was given, first there was the dams, and then there was an interlude where nothing quite went right for the squadron. They were sort of betwixt and between. Then there was news of the V3, which were gun sites being built in northern France that contained a gun that was supposed to be capable of firing, I think, a 500 shell once a minute into London. and beneath 50 foot of reinforced concrete, and no bomb could touch it, and Hitler thought that he had the ideal secret weapon. But Barnes-Wallis was designing Tallboy, which he claimed would penetrate 90 foot of earth if dropped from 16,000 feet. The only thing was, he said he wanted it within 15 yards of the perimeter of the target. Mm. And when I said that was going to give us certain problems from 16,000 feet, he said, well, if you're going to scatter my bombs all over northern France, what's the point of my building them? So we didn't get much sympathy from Barnes-Wallis. But we knew that we had to do this. And it was quite clear that the only way you could do it was, and everybody agreed that, was to drop a marker, not a congregation of markers or conglomeration of markers, the center, the estimated center of which you bombed, but one single unmistakable marker, dead center. Now, at a meeting at Bomber Command, where Bennett was, Air Marshal Bennett, he was asked to do this because they were Pathfinder Force. And he said, I can't do it, it's impossible. And so I said, well, I think so you can, because you can do it low level. And he said, no, you can't do it low level because it's too dangerous. You cannot fly that low at night with a target without danger of crashing. So the result of that was it was thrown back on us, which really was what we wanted, though we didn't think we were going to get it. Now, Mickey Martin was the other person who really believed in low-level flying and marking. But we were forbidden to do it low level. Cochrane said, you may not come lower than 5,000 feet. We said that's the worst of both worlds because we've got heavy flak and light flak. However, we were given our targets in northern France, and we developed this technique on the bombing ranges that if you came point blank at a steepish dive so that the marker wouldn't bounce, if you weren't steep it would bounce, you couldn't miss it. And every time we went out on a trial attack, we did what they asked us to do at 5,000 feet, and genuinely did, and we never got more than 150, 300 yards. And then we came in with a second marker, dive bombing, and every time it was accurate. Well, this is where I think Cochrane, as in so many other ways, displayed he had a real flexibility of thinking. He saw it worked. He realized it meant a complete inversion of everything, that all previous thinking. So he said, I'll get one chance for you to prove it, but you only get one chance. And that was, in fact, turned out to be Limoges. And Limoges was our turning point. It was a target in France. It had to go to the War Cabinet for approval. And the answer came back, yes, we could attack it. It was an aero engine factory to the east of Limoges. But the condition was that we were not to take one civilian life. If we did, we never got a chance, we would never have another chance to try it over France. And you couldn't try over Germany, not with the defences. The snag was there were 500 girls in the factory at the time on night shift, so we had to get them out. But the obvious way to do that was to do two or three very low-level runs at 15, 20 feet above the target. They were, I think, bound to take the hint. We gave them 10 or 15 minutes, I forget which, to get out. The other thing that we'd introduced was it always seemed to me that the basic flaw with Bomber Command's technique was that everybody was briefed to a preconceived plan. And no matter what happened, you could never change that plan. And that, I don't think, is good military thinking. You've got to adapt yourself to what's happening the other side. So we decided that we would build up a communication system between the lead aircraft and his number 2 as well, and all the individual aircraft, so that we were flexible.
Because you were still only talking about one squadron at this time, aren't you?
Yes, but you see, that's all we could do.
Right.
But we were arguing that this system should be
Yep.
adapted to everybody.
Yep.
So that whenever you sent Bomber Command out, it had a command leader who, if in the case of Nuremberg, saw what was happening, could bring everybody back.
Yep.
I mean, there are times you've got to retreat in battle. So we had a very well worked out system, but with better equipment than the main force had. So we would keep our small main force, orbiting a point 50 miles short of the target, staggered at 100 feet or 50 feet, I forget which, so there's little danger of collision. When we'd marked and confirmed the marking was accurate, we'd call them in. And then we'd circle the target and watch. And if anything, if a bomb dropped off target, we'd stop and say, what's the matter? And if you could identify a cause, you'd put it right. If not, you might have to call the attack off.
Yeah.
But anyway, mercifully, it did prove successful. Only one girl was injured, and that because she didn't go further than the ditch the other side of the road.
Yes, if I could interrupt there a second. So you've been using we, if I may say so, a little bit indiscriminately there. You've been using we.
Well, I'm talking about 617.
Yes, but it wasn't all 617 because there were two quite different sets of activities there, weren't there? One was the actual marking, which you personally did in the aircraft.
With Mickey Martin as my
yes,
number 2.
Yes, with you and then Wing Commander Scotty and Martin. And then the other aircraft doing precision bombing on the markers.
Yes.
That's all. I'd just like to make that distinction.
I see, but I'm calling... Yeah, but
I know it was a composite squadron activity.
Yes, I
but
see.
your particular contribution
Yeah, there were 4
was...
low-level markers,
Right.
and the rest were high-flying.
Right, right.
The marker had to be dead on,
Right,
and the bombing had to be dead on.
Right.
They were doing about a 40-mile,
yes.
absolutely
Yes.
rock-steady run.
Yes, because one of the objections by the Pathfinder argument, or the Pathfinder force, was that with a larger group of aircraft, it was not practicable to hold so many aircraft in any kind of box waiting in an area where there could be enemy air activity.
But we wouldn't do that with the
We
main
wouldn't
force.
do that. No.
When we were used for the main force,
I was thinking about Munich, for example.
well, we
later on.
never kept them waiting. All that we did was we used the whole of the squadron as a target marking force, nothing else. We had 4 low-flying aircraft, which then, thank God, were Mosquitoes. They did the usual low-level technique, and then the high-flying squadron aircraft were merely reinforcing with markers to keep them burning and keep them visible through the fires. So as long as we completed our job on time, there was no waiting around.
I see.
The objection actually came over the attack on Mailly-le-Camp.
Oh, yes, with the loss.
But that, with due respect, that was not our fault, because it was a communications fault. And I was desperately trying to call the whole attack off, and none of the main force could hear me.
Wasn't that when you were jammed out? When one
Yeah, there were
Lancaster
two.
kept his
There were 2
RT on?
crews were on transmit, and they were talking,
Right.
talking. But quite apart from that, they weren't used to this method, and they were not receiving us. We were trying it in Morse. We were trying every wavelength we could, which comes back to the point that it seems to me whenever you go out on any form of attack, you have got to have good communications.
Oh, yes, yes. This, of course, is a modern problem,
No,
too.
but it wasn't then.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Yes, the problem of communications probably is at least as complex now, maybe even worse. In this same period, though, you mentioned just in passing there, so the Mosquito.
Yes.
Can you explain how 617 managed to get its own Mosquitoes?
Well, we demonstrated it worked low level in a Lank,
Right.
but a Lank's not the ideal aircraft for
Right.
50-foot flying over defences.
Right.
And so the AOC, Cochrane, said you must put up a memorandum. That's another thing I can't do. I sat for 3 days struggling with this memorandum, and I put it up. And he said, right, the CNC's invited us down, spend the night with them, and you put your case. Bomber Harris. So sort of an awestruck and very junior wing commander went down with Cocky, as we knew him, spent the night with Bomber Harris, and I put my case. And he said, mark me Munich, and I will give you Mosquitoes. Miss Munich, and you lose the Mosquitoes. But Munich, of course, was the worst place he could have given us, because it was at extreme range and very heavily defended. And when it came to the actual morning, we hadn't got our long-range tanks. And the navigators estimated taking off from Manston, the closest point on the English coast, not deviating to miss defended targets on the way, 3 minutes over target there, 15 minutes petrol left when we got back. And we couldn't get the attack postponed. The only time that I'd ever seen the beginning of a look of mutiny I walked into the navigator's hut, and the 4 navigators were sitting there, and they looked at me, and I could see exactly what was going on in their face. They were just saying, this is madness. And I knew that it was this or nothing. We were never going to get the chance again. So I had to say, I'm sorry, we got to go. And mercifully, they did go. And mercifully, the attack succeeded.
Yes, yes. Just wondering, are there any other reflections on that period, sir? Yes, we've thought about the marker, we've thought about the differences of opinion with Air Marshal Bennett. Do you recall anything more, for example, about that quite important meeting at High Wycombe in February that was chaired, I think, by Air Marshal Saunby?
Yes, it
wasn't
was.
it?
Well, it was conducted in very nice spirit. I think everybody was just trying to do their best.
Yes.
I think it made me feel that when you come to important decisions, either in life or in war,
Yes.
people get a sense of responsibility. If there are any differences of personality amongst those, I think they try to play those down. And I feel that one of the most important things you can ever do is to make certain that when you're thinking something out of importance, you are objective.
Yes. Yes.
It's very easy to get carried away. Somebody said something, you don't like him, want to disagree with him. I was impressed by that. I was just calmly thinking out what to do for the best.
Because I suppose you could argue that from that meeting stemmed not only the authorisation for 617 to go ahead,
Yeah.
but also, ultimately, the ability of Bomber Command to play the part that it did before D-Day in attacking the rail targets, in attacking the transportation targets.
Yes, and the E-boat pens that we blew
Yes,
up.
would you care to say a word about that, about the E-boat things? Because this was also using the tall boy, was it not?
Yes, the idea was to not only knock out the E-boat pens, but to blow all the ships in the harbour out of the harbour, which in fact it did with Tallboy, with a deep underwater blast. I remember it because it was a daylight attack, and fortunately I was the first person in. So and my technique, we all got a different way of doing things, but I prefer to get into trouble quickly and not think about it and worry about getting out of it once you're in, because the human's sense of survival is very strong. And once you're in trouble, you're going to get out somehow. If you hang around too long waiting, you've taken part of your energy away with just worrying about what's going to happen.
Yes.
So I went straight in, and I got in a little bit before all the guns started up. Not quite, it was still unpleasant. And then I had to order Dave Shannon in. And Dave Shannon had a navigator who was an ex-guardsman who'd become, joined the Air Force. He was a great, tough man. We used to have a very heavy black torch, you know, a rubber torch. He pulled this out, and he held it above Dave's head, and he said, "Dave, if you go into that target, you're going to get this torch on your..." He's not lived that down.
Yes.
He went in.
Yes. Yes, yes, I'm
But
sure.
it did destroy the E-boat pens, and the E-boats were causing difficulties to the
Yes.
invasion fleet, and it blew at least 10 ships straight out of the water onto the quayside. So Barnes-Wallis had a big bomb.
Yes, yes, indeed he had. Also in this period, you reverted almost, well, in fact, you did revert to a single-seat driver, didn't you? Didn't you fly a Mustang for the first time?
Yeah, we lost our mosquitoes.
Yes.
Somebody else argued a prior claim on them. And
Which,
we
if
did,
I may interrupt, incidentally, you converted yourself, didn't you? You just climbed into the Mosquito and flew it. You didn't bother about any further training at that stage.
well, I had to get the Mustang, and the only way I got the Mustang was to go to the Americans.
Ah.
I just on Earl Boyce system said, "Would you give me a Mustang?"
Yes.
And I mean, the Americans do that kind of thing.
Yes.
You know, we wouldn't, but
Yes.
they said, yes,
Definitely.
certainly. But they only delivered it the day we had an op. So, and they only got it out of the crate and assembled it by just after tea. And there was no time to air test it or anything. My chief problem was that I couldn't work out my course properly, so I had to go to the navigators. The navigators knew I was going to have to go and ask their help. And that was the one situation they wanted to get me in. I had to eat humble pie. They worked me out a course.
Yes, yes. So by that, sorry.
No, my other worry was how I was going to land the aircraft when we got back, not having flown a single-seater since
Well, since the...
Airmen's
yes, at what?
University.
Yes, quite, the tutor. yes. So, by that time, you'd done low-level marking in the Lancaster, the Mosquito, and the Mustang. I suppose there was one, paradoxically, one slightly less impressive contribution. That was the time of D-Day, was it not, when the squadron simply flew as decoy with window and felt rather hurt about it?
Yeah, well, our pride was hurt, you know, that silly way. We thought we ought to be right in the middle of something spectacular.
Yes,
yes. But I suppose you could say it was perhaps one of the best ops we did in terms of saving life.
Yes, indeed, in terms of contribution. Well, in July 1944, so you were taken off operations, and shortly after that, in addition to the 3 DSOs and DFC, which you had now been awarded, you were then awarded the Victoria Cross. And if I may, I would just like to quote a few words from that citation, which read, "He led his squadron personally on every occasion, always undertaking the most dangerous and difficult task of marking the target alone from a low level. Wing Commander Cheshire's cold and calculated acceptance of risks is exemplified by his conduct in an attack on Munich in April 1944. In 4 years of fighting against the bitterest opposition, he has maintained a record of outstanding personal achievement, placing himself invariably in the forefront of the battle." But in fact, sir, that was not the end of your operational flying, was it? Because just about a year later, you were in a B-29 flying from the island of Tinian in the Marianas towards Nagasaki. Could you comment on the events of that morning of August the 9th, 1945?
Well, it was a very strange attack to us, because we were flying extremely high. We were briefed to fly 30,000 feet, and my pilot was flying 39,000 feet. No flak could reach us. No fighter could keep up with a B-29 at that height. So everything was strange. We didn't form up with the other 2 aircraft we should have done. We didn't attack the main target because the lead aircraft decided to abort and to go for the secondary target because of weather. We were obviously in a high emotional state, though I suppose we wouldn't have admitted it. It was something completely new. We felt this is the end of the war. We felt this is making history. And not very commendable, but you feel a bit self-important when you're in a situation like that. I had to keep my feet on the ground because my job was to make a report on the tactical implications of the bomb and everything. We were 50 miles away when the bomb actually went off, and we should have been 10 miles away. It was 9 o'clock in the morning of the bright sun, and even then we caught the flash in the cockpit. I mean, so many pictures have been shown of atomic bombs now that it doesn't serve much to describe that one. The only 2 impressions, main impressions I had, was one of the astonishing speed that it was rocketing upwards. And secondly, it seemed to me to have a symmetry to it. It was a great cloud poised on a column that seemed to me beautifully sculpted, symmetrical, whereas all other high explosions that I've seen are ragged. And somehow that gave the impression of controlled power, which was much more frightening than like an angry man against a level-headed man. You're worse off against a level-headed man if he's going for you. I think that the big impact was the war is over. And however hard it may seem looking at it now, that was really the only thing that I wanted, to see the war ended. I mean, when you look at it now, that war cost 55 million lives on both sides. The only way to end it, the only known way to end it, was the invasion of Japan at an estimated cost of 3 million men. Yeah. And this took 100,000.
Yes, yes.
So that was the first thought. But the second thought, which is paradoxical, is that you begin to feel compassion for the people under this vast boiling cloud.
Yes. Yes, thank you, sir. I wonder if in the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have, if I could put perhaps 2 rather more personal questions to you. One, I think I'm right in saying that your subsequent decision to adopt the Catholic faith was not directly caused by the experience at Nagasaki.
Oh, no, it had nothing to do with
No,
that.
right. I'd just like to clear that, because I know sometimes there has been that misapprehension. And going back now to the general war experiences, you frequently in your career displayed obviously inflexible determination, frequent exuberance, and occasionally perhaps what would now be called irresponsibility. But throughout it all, you seem to possess an ability to conceal your emotions, particularly the strain of battle. Was that because you didn't feel any physical strain, because you didn't think about it, or because you were a very good concealer of emotions?
I think that I was okay in one situation and I would not have been okay in another situation. There was something about being in an aircraft that made me feel safe. The noise of the engines gave me sort of heart. And the fact there was a tiny bit of perspex there was a protection to me. And I think that I was built in a way that I didn't really think about the guns and the danger. I was thinking about the mechanics and the technique and the tactics of how to get there. And I've seen so many men, when you're briefing them, one man's thinking of the danger and he's frightened. The other man's thinking, we've got to get there. And the second man will do the more spectacular thing. But I feel the first man has done the braver thing, because I can't really see that there is courage except where there's fear. It's the conquering of fear.
Yes, yes, yes.
But I would finally like to say that we're not very good judges of ourselves. And when Cochrane took us off 617, all the old hands were taken off in one fell swoop, and we were absolutely indignant and furious. We said, there's nothing wrong with us, we're good for another 6 months. But that night we suddenly began to all behave like little children. And when I went to bed, I said to myself, he was right. We were under a strain, but we didn't know it.
You obviously had a very high regard for Air Marshal Cochrane. I wonder if, in the last question, so I could put to you, just really a broad reflection on leadership in war, as you experienced it, as you saw it, as perhaps indeed you suffered from it. And leading perhaps to a final comment, it's always very difficult to encapsulise any kind of extractions or abstractions, but could you do that? Could you leave, if you had one thought to leave with the aircrew of 1978 on the subject of leadership, how would it come from your own experiences?
Well, my first thought would be is that you've got to be completely and absolutely professional. And I think you've got to live your job. You've got to go to bed thinking about it, wake up thinking about it. When you come to war, I don't say necessarily in peace. You've got to be a complete master of your particular medium, so that no single part of your mind is on the business of flying, only on what you've got to do. And the second thing is, at whatever level your leadership is, you must relate to every single individual under you. You must be personally concerned with his well-being and let him know that you are. And I think you ought to be able to assess what he's capable of doing and to what heights he can be lifted when the emergency comes. But if your personal relationship isn't good, then I don't think you'll make a very good leader.
Well, that, I think, sir, is a very appropriate point to conclude, and I would only say it's been a very great privilege for us to welcome you here, and thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.